The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and thanks for joining us today discussing the Proofpoint and Palo Alto Networks partnership and integration. My name is Shona Bradshaw. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at Bytes SP, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Matt Smith from Palo Alto Networks and Richard Davis from Proofpoint to look at how their strategic partnerships aims to close some of the security silos and gaps that can lead to vulnerabilities for organisations. So just a quick agenda for today's webinar. I'll have a bit of housekeeping at the start, then I'll introduce you to Bytes very briefly. I will keep that very brief, as many of you know as well already, before handing over and introducing Matt and Richard. They'll be taking you through some of the reasons why multi-channel protection and integrated protection is so important in today's threat landscapes, before then getting into the nitty-gritty of the technical security integration between Palo Alto Networks, Wildfire and Proofpoint solutions. Then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So housekeeping for today's session. Attendee lines are on mute throughout today's presentations, but please, we do welcome questions and interaction throughout the session, so please do post those questions via the chat or the questions box. In terms of the rules of engagement for today's session, we will be getting into strategy and solutions and technical discussions. We won't be getting in depth into any detailed commercials on this session. Of course, those conversations are more than welcome via your Bytes account manager after the session. We were recording today's session and we'll make that available to yourselves and those people who couldn't attend the session live. And also we do have a feedback survey at the end. It's a very short 6-question survey just to make sure that these sessions are hitting the mark for you technically and content wise. If you could take a little minute to fill it in at the end, that would be greatly appreciated. So who are Bytes Security Partnerships? We are the security specialist reseller in the Bytes Altron group. We were purchased by Bytes back in 2011, and what we aim to do is to marry up the specialism and the agility and insight and very personal approach that you would expect from the smallest specialist security partner with the scale and stability and resources that comes from being part of a multi-billion-dollar group. We're exceptionally proud at Bytes Security Partnerships of the technical expertise that we wrap around the solutions that we recommend to customers, whether that's in-house consultancy and technical services or support via to our direct to escalation level engineers on the solutions. This allows us to enjoy top tier vendor partnerships with the likes of Palo and Proofpoint, whom we're a platinum partner with, which means that we deliver value both on the commercial and the technical side. We work across the full spectrum of information security, from the next generation firewall that we're talking about today and content security through to cloud security, mobile security, authentication, access and identity. So we're a pure security specialist reseller. What we offer across all of those is that suite of technical services and that extension of your IT security teams that enables you to future-proof your business, whether you're looking for training and knowledge transfer services, whether you're looking for support on and delivery of services, whether you're looking to develop security strategy and map technology. We have a suite of services and a dedicated consultancy service to assist. So that's more than enough about us. Why are we talking to businesses about closing security gaps, and why are we talking to businesses and raising awareness of the Palo Alto Networks and Proofpoint partnership? Advanced threats are now spanning very different attack vectors, whether it's network, endpoint, social, email, or a combination of the above. And businesses are increasingly accepting that layering different security solutions that don't have integrations and don't configure and align with each other actually creates security silos and vulnerabilities in themselves, slowing down the potential response to threats. And that's why we're speaking to businesses at the moment about aligned solutions that provide unified reporting and valuable context and essentially speed up the response as solutions work in partnership and in tandem. So today's webinar is really to show you how that works and give you a flavour of how Palo and Proofpoint have teamed up and created a technical partnership to assist in that light. All that remains for me to do is to introduce Richard and Matt. Both are security integration and product experts in their respective companies. Both companies are Gartner Magic Quadrant leading organisations in their respective areas. Palo Alto Networks from a network security firewall and an endpoint perspective, and Proofpoint from an email and content security perspective. Proofpoint, we have an exceptionally strong and growing relationship with. Since 2017, we've been one of their platinum partners. And Palo Alto Networks is a real growing relationship and emerging partner for us. We really feel that they are fantastic, that the integration that they've developed is really worth bringing to the market, because it really does allow people to directly integrate and provide optimal protection, along with that all-important ease of administration. So without further ado, I'm going to put myself on mute, pass over to Richard. He'll get into the technical nitty-gritty and talk to you about how those solutions do indeed integrate. Over to Richard.
Hey, thank you, Shona, and good morning to everybody. I'm Richard Davis. I'm one of the cybersecurity strategists for Proofpoint. So I spend my life talking to organizations about how they can better plan their cybersecurity strategy and how it ties into the bigger picture. So I'm just going to share my screen and get going into a couple of slides just to kick things off. Okay. So in my section this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can build a people-centric security strategy using visibility and data that Proofpoint can provide. I'm going to touch on the Proofpoint and Palo Alto integrations and introduce them, and I'll leave Matt to actually talk in more detail around some of the technical aspects of the integration, and then just finish with a quick customer case study. So for us here at Proofpoint, we're really focused on meeting the needs of the changing threat landscape. And what that means to us is actually shifting how we think about protecting people in the same way that attackers are now focusing on attacking the individuals within the organization. You know, we've done an extremely good job of protecting our network. But as more services transition to the cloud, as more people work off network, the priority has to shift. And the attackers have seen this, and they've shifted to attacking individuals. 99% of every attack that we currently see and track actually requires the individual to do something, whether it be open and run malware that's simply attached or enter credentials into a form, or in the case of an impersonation-based attack, perhaps wire money to an incorrect account. So we've really focused our protection on understanding how people are being attacked, and then providing technology to address that accordingly. And for us, that really starts with an understanding of who the very attacked people are within an organization. Because even the smallest organization can now use this data to actually build an adaptive policy, moving slightly away from a one-size-fits-all. I think as we think about cybersecurity strategy, it's always a balance between the acceptable risk and the impact on the business. And I think we're in a position now where we can actually put a slightly more restrictive policy in for certain users, where there is slightly more of a business impact, because we can now understand who those people are. And of course, most people would assume it's the VIPs, and that is the case in some organizations. But more often than not, the top list is actually includes a lot of people that you wouldn't expect. So to understand who your very attacked people are, we need to look at three areas. Firstly, we actually need to look who is actually being attacked. But what are they being attacked by? Because actually that's more important. Are they receiving highly targeted and sophisticated threats that are actually coming from known threat actors? Or are they actually receiving high volume attacks that pretty much the entire world is seeing? Because that's going to affect your response to that type of attack. But more so, actually, who represents a risk to your organization? There are key people within the organization who have access to critical sensitive data, whether it be financial information or PII, or perhaps intellectual property. But there's also people in the organization who have privileged account access because they're administrators of databases or systems. So both of those two groups pose a risk. And then finally, even if somebody's being attacked and they have privileged access, if they're not vulnerable to that attack, then they pose less of a risk on the organization. So actually understanding whether people fall for these types of attacks is key to driving this initiative. I think everybody can probably point to somebody in an organization that will click on everything, the perennial clicker, that no matter how much you train them, they just continue to click on bad stuff. And if we've got a high score in all three of these areas, then we've got a real problem. And that's definitely an individual in the organization who we need to pay special attention to. So what does this mean? Well, this means that we can actually then think about putting in place a series of adaptive controls, moving away from that one-size-fits-all policy for an organization. So we can look at this in 4 different areas. And the first of these areas is technology. So if we're deploying new technology, we're typically deploying solutions that are solving problems that we've got, but we base that on the priority, the likelihood of the particular attack, and then the impact of that attack. And this data helps you understand that information. But more so, in a lot of cases, you're going to actually deploy new technology first for those VAP users. That's a very sensible thing to do to protect the most vulnerable people, the most attacked people first. Secondly, with the existing technology we've got in place, you can actually build a better policy focused around those users, such as actually turn up the account privilege control for those users, maybe force unknown emails through a web isolation service to provide that extra layer of protection. Perhaps also you can change your policy within your Palo Alto stack to provide a more restrictive policy for those individuals. We can then think about the response side of things, because if we can understand who's most likely to be attacked, then this actually helps us to prioritize the alerts that are coming in. We can actually provide some sort of automated limited access for those users while we investigate. And we can maybe think about how we assign training based on the types of attacks individuals are seeing. And then finally, there's certain real-time controls that we can put in place. So we can force two-factor authentication based on an incident and the automated detection of that incident. Maybe assigning a risk to a non-malicious URL, or a URL that doesn't appear malicious at the time of coming in, but forcing web isolation of that URL because it's been registered recently through a suspicious registrar is a real-time control that we can put in place that's going to, again, help protect our users. So if we segue slightly and we actually look at what a top 20 very attacked person report looks like, here's a great example from a European global advertising company. Now, as we'd expect, the CEO is in there, but they're actually a little way down the list. And actually, if we look at the top 4, they're actually much more attacked than anybody else. And this isn't just down to the volume. This is actually looking at the sophistication of the attack. So who it's coming from, the severity, and the targeted nature of that attack. That's actually more important than the sheer number of messages that people have had. And we can see on here that actually the top 3 are all in a similar area. They're all in communications and PR. And when we worked with the organization and looked into this, we discovered that these individuals are the ones that actually manage the press releases for acquisitions. And this company constantly acquires new, smaller advertising companies and media companies. So this was great information for the threat actors. They were using this for monetary gain, simply to buy stock in those smaller companies that are about to be acquired. Not a group of individuals who you think are typically highly attacked users, but in this case, very much so. And the fourth one I wanted to highlight was the generic info email address. This is actually something we see across pretty much every organization. And we believe that the reason for this is twofold. Firstly, obviously, you hit a lot of people in one go with that. But secondly, generic email addresses tend to go to group mailboxes. Group mailboxes are not something you can easily protect with two-factor authentication. So it's a great way of gaining access and potentially compromising access into an account, which will allow you to then move laterally within an organization. But we find that our customers who use this data find this invaluable. Not only can you use it to report up in the organization to show the types of attacks you're facing and the technology you've put in place to solve this, but it helps drive that policy that I've already talked about and those adaptive controls that you can put in place. So let's look at a couple of quick examples. So this is the executive that everybody typically thinks would be a VAP. And if we look at the scores, from an attack point of view, this user is actually in the top 10 most attacked people. and actually the top 5 for the last 30 days. From a privilege point of view, yes, they're a VIP. They also have very high level access to sensitive data across both email and also cloud solutions that they use. So definitely somebody we need to protect. On the flip side, actually from a vulnerability perspective, they're a slightly lower risk because they aren't failing phish simulation tests. So there's somebody that is educated around the types of threats they should use. But on the flip side, we know that they are often off-net and they're using risky devices. And their use of multi-factor is inconsistent. And this means that we can then look at particular policy controls we put in place. From an access control point of view, you can actually start looking at the devices they're connecting in from, where they're connecting in from, and that may actually affect the policy you're putting in place within your Palo Alto estate, which will provide a greater level of protection for that user. We may want to sign them up to Proofpoint's VIP-based email service that provides a high level of threat control and an email analysis for those top VIP users. Maybe we want to tailor the training for that user accordingly based on the threats they're seeing. And in this second example, we've got that customer service clicker that I talked about earlier. That person always clicks, and of course, their vulnerability score is really high. They always fail phish simulation tests. They're not currently deployed with multi-factor in this case, and they're also connecting from off-net on occasions. They're, however, not in that very top list of VIP or VAP users, but they do have access to sensitive data. They're going to have access to customer, personal, and financial data. So again, that leads us to actually think about putting in place specific policy for them. We might want to actually isolate all their web traffic because they're not somebody that needs to use the web day in, day out necessarily. So when they do, when they're clicking on links from customer interactions, we can isolate all that traffic and provide an extra layer of protection for that. We can also perhaps increase the detection around suspicious logins when they're accessing some of the cloud platforms or from outside that organization. So again, this is why this level of analysis can be very useful in driving a better overall security posture within your organization. So if we're really focused around protecting people, we need to think about how people are attacked. And I think it's clear, no matter who you talk to, not only our own research, but Verizon's data breach report, a number of the analyst firms, including Gartner and Forrester, everyone is in agreement that somewhere between 90 and 95% of all attacks come in via external email. So we need to think about how we protect organizations through this area. And this has to be the first area that we look at. But we're seeing an increase in attacks now focused around getting access to cloud accounts, either through password reuse and intelligent variants of passwords that have been lost in breaches, like the Dropbox breach, of credential phish to gain access to those accounts. And of course, once you gain access to those accounts, you can then move laterally within the organization via internal email, which isn't always as well protected as external email, to compromise other people. But we've also seen an increasing trend to use social engineering to now trick individuals to giving up their personal webmail. We've seen instances where the threat actors started a conversation, then sent malicious files in, which of course the Proofpoint Palo Alto combination blocks. So they try again and it gets blocked again. But then of course the threat actor says to the user, oh, I'm struggling to get my tender document into you. And of course the individual in the organization really wants to be able to respond to that tender. So when the threat actor says, hey, if you've got a personal account I can send it to, so I can send this file through, they give up their personal account, and that becomes an attack vector as well. So we cover all of this. We've covered off the key areas that our people can be attacked. On the flip side, we need to think about the adaptive controls that we put in place across not only email usage, but also cloud use and the use across the web and the general network. And this really focuses around the ability to stop data exfiltration and data loss, both from an inadvertent point of view, but also a malicious point of view, as well as thinking about how we can extend that into the identity deception issue. Ultimately, if you can't attack a person within an organization, the cyber criminals will start to attack your business partners and your customers by pretending to be you, and we need to make sure we cover that off as well. So if we think about it from a holistic point of view, this is what it looks like. And this maps really nicely to a bunch of different technology areas. Each of these can be solved with a different set of technology. And I'm not going to walk through in detail this today, but of course, here at Proofpoint, this maps to a series of products within our portfolio. And for a lot of our customers, this is a journey. And this journey starts with protecting people across those key threat vectors. Start with email and make sure you're doing a great job of protecting email. Use the Palo Alto integration to strengthen the detection of inbound malicious content via email. Think about how you can test and train your users to actually make your users more resilient to those threats. Think about how you can deploy technology to minimize the damage that can occur should the worst happen. And then finally, we can extend out that protection across those broader ecosystem areas. So with that overview complete, I just want to move on now and start talking about the partnership that we've put in place. This partnership's been in place for a little while now, and we've been extremely successful in protecting some of the world's largest organizations with a number of the technical integrations that we have put in place. So for us, the reason for the partnership really was to bring best of breed in two key areas. As shown and highlighted at the beginning of the webinar, we are both leaders in our respective Gartner Magic Quadrants. Actually, we're a leader in 3 different Gartner Magic Quadrants across a number of different areas, including security awareness training and information archiving. And of course, Palo Alto have their strengths around being the leading next generation firewall and have extended their portfolio since. And we really wanted to bring that together to provide not only a business integration, but also a technical integration. So we want to provide unmatched visibility and automated coordinated protection, which means that in effect, you get 2 bites of the cherry. If an email is coming in and Proofpoint scanning it, let's make sure that Palo Alto's Wildfire can scan it in the same way. And we're integrating that combined intelligence to provide richer data back to users around what is actually happening within that organization. But also feed data in so that the data that we gain through the email channel can do a better job of protecting the rest of the estate and the other products within both the Proofpoint and Palo Alto product sets that you may also be utilizing. But the final thing we wanted to do is we wanted to make this really easy to set up. We didn't want this implementation to take days and days to put in place. So we built a very easy way to provide an immediate return on investment at no extra cost for people who have both the Proofpoint and Palo Alto product sets. So as I highlighted, we did this to bring best of breed in a number of different areas together and to provide these unified forensics. So the technical integration is based around API integrations and the ability to simply integrate via an API key in the other system. And Matt will touch in a little more detail about how that is accomplished. But from an integration point of view, we've got 4 key integration points. The first of which is to integrate Proofpoint's targeted attack protection. That's our next generation advanced detection capability for both URLs and attachments with Palo Alto's Wildfire next generation detection capability. We wanted to extend that so customers that are running our digital risk product, looking at social media protection, can also use Wildfire to analyze URLs that are appearing on their social media accounts to provide protection for those people who manage social media for an organization. There's a lot of banks now that use social media to interact with their customers to provide customer service. We need to make sure that we're protecting those users. From a threat intelligence point of view, we have a really nice integration between Palo Alto Networks MindMail system and our own Proofpoint threat intelligence platform. And then finally, as I touched on earlier in the webinar, we want to provide the integration between Proofpoint's VAP information and the adaptive controls and policy that you can put in place to actually get more out of your investment in Palo Alto Networks. So in a nutshell, we want to increase visibility and protection. We want to make it really simple to implement this. We want to do this at no added cost and provide automated instant response through combining the two platforms. So what does this look like at a slightly deeper level? Well, Proofpoint's target attack protection capability takes email that comes in through the gateway, and we can block immediately known malicious attachments and URLs at the gateway. But anything that is not known at the point of delivery into the gateway, we can hold, and in the case of attachments, send to the Proofpoint target attack protection next generation threat detection platform, including sandboxing and behavioral analysis. Off the back of that, we provide actionable insight and deep intelligence around what's happening with that threat, and I'll show you that shortly. Obviously, on the Wildfire side, they're providing very similar technology to understand the behavior of files that are passing through and can be analyzed through Wildfire, providing a similar level of threat intelligence. So by joining the two together, we get better protection, because if Proofpoint doesn't detect something, then there's a very high chance that Wildfire will, and vice versa. So either has the ability to condemn a threat and block it before it even gets through to the mailbox, but then providing a single source of that detection and forensic information. So within the Proofpoint's TAP dashboard, you can get not only information on the Proofpoint analysis, but also the Wildfire analysis as well. So I'll let Matt go through the high-level detail of the integration, but in a nutshell, an email will come in to our secure email gateway, into our attachment defense module, and we will send unknown threats not only to Proofpoint's target attack protection sandbox, but also to the Wildfire sandbox as well. We will then send forensic information to Proofpoint's dashboard, as well as quarantining the email, and we'll provide that integrated threat intelligence between both the Palo Alto and the Proofpoint systems, which then means that that automated protection can then pass across the rest of that Palo Alto Networks stack. So with that, I'm going to segue slightly, and I just want to give a very brief overview of our TAP dashboard and the information that you can get in the TAP dashboard. So I've already logged into our dashboard here. I'm into one of our demo examples, and I've come straight into the TAP dashboard to our overview page. So this is threat overview in the last 14 days for both attachments and URLs for all category types except spam. And we can see here, based on severity of impact, a number of different threats. But actually, probably what's more useful is to get a high-level report. So we can not only see an overall effectiveness report, but we can click on the People tab, and then this is our current VAP report of the most attacked users. And through an integration with the directory, we get not only the name, but also the title of that particular user. But if we mouse over that, we can also get information around their business unit, their location, as well as their full email address. And then we get a summary for each individual user as to how they're being attacked, and the overall score based on our attack index for those users. And of course, this information here can then be exported out of the system, and this list can be used within a directory to set a security group for very attacked people that you can periodically update. So if we then click back on threats, I just want to give you a few examples of the types of data that we find and the level of information that we expose. So this is a very widespread campaign. We can see here that this campaign was actually sent to a large number of Proofpoint customers, and it wasn't targeted on a particular vertical. So, you know, quite low risk, although Obviously, it's a very large, widespread campaign with a very large number of URLs. So certainly not targeted on this organization. However, we look at a different example here, and we can see that this was actually only seen by 6 Proofpoint customers. And we can understand the information around the specific attack. We can see that this is actually an imposter or an impersonation email detected via our impersonation classifier. So specifically impersonating an individual user within that organization or somebody that that organization trusts. And we can drill down into more detail if we need to. In this example here, we can see that it was a single message to this organization. It was sent to a medium number of Proofpoint customers. And we can see the detail around this particular attack, including forensic information. And we can see that not only was this condemned via Proofpoint sandboxing, but also our threat analysts have been looking at this and have provided a write-up, which is why you get a description over here with IOC data, etc. as well as a number of different samples that we can tie back to this campaign. And I think the other important thing here is screenshots that actually show you what this particular attack looks like, so that you can have a follow-up conversation with a member of staff to see whether they were actually susceptible to this type of attack. In this next example here, and I've highlighted this because this is one that is a joint forensic analysis with Wildfire, we can see that this did go again to a high number of customers. We've got information about it, so it's a remote access Trojan. We know the malware family as well, and we've got a breakdown of the attack. The interesting thing here is that we've got information from Proofpoint, sandboxing, Palo Alto Wildfire, as well as threat analysts, and we can look at each of these individual reports, including the Wildfire report here. So without needing to go into the Wildfire system, we can look at the high-level information. So we can see the environment that it was executed in, an overall summary of the reasons for the detection, but we can then go down in and look at far more detail in each of these different categories if we need to. We can change the report, and we can change it to, for instance, our analysts' forensic report, where they're actually providing a series of URLs based on command and control. Or we can actually look at our dynamic analysis in the Proofpoint sandbox and see that level of information as well. So this is a great example of not only Wildfire dynamic and static analysis, but we've got Proofpoint's dynamic and static analysis as well as an analyst forensic write-up. So 5 different sources of information on this threat that you can use to correlate that threat. And then finally, just to close out, there's an example here of a credential phish found within OneDrive, and again detected via Proofpoint sandboxing, seen by a fairly known number of Proofpoint customers. And we can again double click into a number of different areas here, including the intended users within that organization. We can actually drill down into more information around each of these attributes as well. So with that, I'm just going to close out with a real-world example here. So this is a customer that we turned on the integration for. And within 30 days, they saw a very substantial increase in the number of block threats. They were seeing a 98.5% block rate of unknown threats. So threats detected via the Proofpoint sandbox at the point of entry. They turned on the integration, and their effectiveness went from 98.5 to 99.8 with the Palo Alto Wildfire integration. And this not only had the effect of actually obviously increasing the block rate, but the knock-on effect of that was reducing the number of support hours needed by about 40 hours a week. And not only that, but they were able to then take that to the board and actually show the consolidated forensics and the value they gained through the partnership between buying best-of-breed Proofpoint and best-of-breed Palo Alto Networks. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass to Matt, who's going to go into a little bit more detail around the Palo Alto side and a little bit more technical detail around the integration. So Matt, over to you.
Grant, thank you very much, Richard. And good morning to everyone else who is on the call with us today. So yes, my name is Matt Smith. I work for Palo Alto Networks, and my responsibility is I'm one of the systems engineers here, and pretty much spend all my time looking at threats. How do we go about resolving threats, and how do we kind of move the world forward, really? So I'm just waiting for the go-to webinar system to tell me I can share my screen, which it's not going to at the moment. Anyway, in the meantime, while we're waiting for GoToWebinar to catch up, what I'll do is...
It should be okay now, Matt.
Grand, okay. Let me just see. It is not letting me. There we go. Excellent. So you should be able to see that. There we go. So in the meantime, what I'll do is I'm going to talk about how this integration kind of works in a bit more detail, but how you can leverage kind of the investment of having next generation firewalling and endpoint security, perhaps stuff running in the cloud, and leveraging that intelligence that the Proofpoint proposition and solution stack has to offer, and actually how you can maximize the effectiveness of that. So, as Richard pointed out earlier, there are really these kind of 4 key integration points around the joint proposition. So, the first one being having Wildfire be another analysis engine, be another data source of information. And the good thing about that is because Wildfire is the Palo Alto Networks technology, it means that when there is something detected, that it will share that information with other Palo Alto Networks technologies, whether that be firewalling, endpoint, stuff running in the cloud or whatever. But it also means you can export that data through something like MindMeld, which is free and open source, or into a SOAR platform of your choice, like Demisto or Phantom or anything you're using, and use that information to further enhance security postures in other areas of the network, which is quite a powerful thing. And what we can also do is actually then run, so I'm going to hopefully show you later on, called Autofocus, which is almost like a looking glass into that data, so I can give you some kind of context around when we talk about threats, and specifically in this scenario about email. Actually, what does that mean in terms of an organization in the makeup? So again, looking at that integration piece, we have kind of the data input sources, if you like, whether that be Proofpoint, firewalling, endpoint, things in the cloud, wherever else. There is the threat response engine, which can be a multitude of many things. It could be like Demisto from us, it could be a SOAR platform, it could be some proprietary you've written yourself. But what it also allows us to do is to take that data from Proofpoint's own analysis engine and use that as an information source for us as well, through MindMeld or whatever. And as Richard pointed out, it's very, very good because you can start thinking slightly outside the box. So if I have a user who perhaps is susceptible to phishing or has triggered a phishing alarm from the Proofpoint platform, what I could do is take that data and go and automate a phishing attack campaign of my own against that user, perhaps as an education exercise, or perhaps go to Active Directory and change their security group membership, which may have a knock-on effect. The firewall might be saying, well, if I see a user in that group, they need to go through 2FA to get to my office environment, to get to my Salesforce, get to my finance system, or whatever it is. It actually makes sure that that user, when submitting credentials to the internet, that we can now start looking for things like if they are submitting domain credentials off to a social media service or a shopping service or whatever they're logging into, and then use that again as an additional decision-making factor. Now, what I want to do is actually talk about kind of the evolution of threats and kind of how this has really come about. So, Wildfire has been around for pretty much as long as this integration has existed, and all the way back to 2011, where predominantly we were looking at Windows portable executables on the Windows XP platform, and it was just coming from firewalling. And over time, what's been going on is we've been trying to bring that response time down. You can see at the bottom 24 hours, all the way down to things like 30 minutes in 2015, where we expanded the capability to look at additional file types. And what is very interesting is when we look at the global statistics that Wildfire produces, everyone gets very hung up on the possibility of PDFs or Office documents being malicious. Now, in terms of sheer volume, we see Office documents be the #1 file type that Wildfire will inspect. But in terms of its toxicity rate, which is the measure of how many of those files are actually malicious, it's actually very, very small. It's in the single-digit percentile ranges, whereas Windows portable executables, on the other hand, are smaller in number, but they have a very high toxicity rate, typically around 80 to 90%. And everyone says immediately, well, my mail gateway is going to be blocking executables, VB scripts, screensaver files, all that type of stuff coming through, which hopefully you'll have in place. And if you don't, please go ahead and put that in immediately. But what we're now seeing is actually those Office documents are now being weaponized in such a way where they are doing what we might call a fileless attack, where they are invoking something like PowerShell, for example, on the back end, to actually go and pull down a malware payload. Something that is not typically seen by an analysis engine, something that is very rarely looked at in terms of firewall logs and file auditing that happens on file systems and things like that. So it's actually very, very difficult to keep track of these events. Whereas if we have that intelligence ahead of time from something like Wildfire, then we can make a much more informed decision at the mail gateway layer. And again, as time's gone on, we've integrated the Proofpoint kind of solution stack in around 2015. That's when we went public with it, but it had existed before that. And what we started seeing as a result of that was a massive sudden jump from 870 million files inspected in a year to 2.2 billion the following year. And this is the per year number, this is not the overall number. So it's a huge amount more data we've got, and a large chunk of that did actually come from the Proofpoint integration. Simply because people were looking at it and going, well, I'm receiving 10,000 emails a day, 3,000 of them have attachments on them, and I don't really know what happens once those attachments leave the MTA, once they hit my local file system, what then happens? What does that user do? Is it a phishing site, etc.? And having one input source is good, having two is even better. You get a much more kind of consistent view of what is good and what is bad. So again, moving forward, 2017, which didn't seem that long ago now, 4.4 billion files were analyzed. Again, a big chunk of that coming from mail applications as the primary source, into last year and then into the future. So what I want to kind of show you in a bit more detail later on is actually some statistics around what these threats are, how they work, and what you can kind of expect and see, and how much of a typical organization's malware that we find can be very easily just shut down by simply turning on one simple feature. Now, to give you some kind of context to these numbers, so Wildfire itself has 29,000 unique organizations in some capacity, all submitting data on a minute-by-minute basis, where we will turn around just over 230,000 basically preventative signatures or measures or IOCs within that 5-minute window, which is pretty cool, pretty unique. And it means that we can do stuff at really rapid scale, whether that be a malware signature or blacklisting a domain, or querying or blacklisting DNS requests, or learning about new command and control channels. It's very, very interesting. And as a result of that, there is a single signature that Wildfire produced all on its own with no human interaction that covers 1.2 million pieces of malware that existed. And that attack campaign was actually an email-based attack campaign. So historically, you would have been in the scenario where you're going to have this attack campaign where there is a malicious attachment, and there are 1.2 million variants of this. How would you even go about stopping that? Where do you even begin, or how many rules you're going to have to create? What's my update schedule going to look like? Is the vendor I've gone with able to get an update out quick enough once a new variant's been discovered. All this weird and wonderful stuff is very hard to do in the real world. So if we can start automating that, and again, to give you kind of the background to this, there's 200,000 firewalls feeding data minute by minute across 5 million endpoints and 1,000 SaaS apps. We have 40 partners, being Proofpoint being one of the main contributors of that information to us, which is really, really key. Now, as I mentioned earlier, once Wildfire detects something, whether this be from the Proofpoint integration or wherever, and we're able to start turning that information into usable data. So whether that be reprogramming things at the network layer, the endpoint, in the cloud, or even on third-party vendors now, we have our acquisition of things like Demisto, and of course you can integrate it with any automation platform of your choice, whether it's ServiceNow, Resilient, whatever, and use that information to make more informed decisions. Use the human element of the analysis engine to say, this looks like a phishing site, but how bad is it? Is it simply a case of it's a really shoddy looking thing, or is it actually a really well-crafted phishing site? And as a result of that, I might make a different decision with my users or my infrastructure than I would have done any otherwise. Now, what is becoming very, very scary is the rate of malware detected out of the sample size. So, for example, if you were saying I have 1,000 files analyzed, go back 2-3 years ago, of those 1,000, we might say 100 of them were malicious, whereas today we might say 400 of them are malicious. So it's a huge increase that's happening, and quite frankly, it's getting easier in some respects to exploit a system, with a lot of users going mobile and not really sitting behind a traditional perimeter. That perimeter concept has kind of been dead for a while now, and that perimeter only really exists at the user and at their endpoint. How do we enforce all this great stuff while simultaneously having the same level of protection? It's a very different conversation to have. But what we're seeing is actually this key stat in the middle, which is of every sample we analyze, we send a copy to VirusTotal. And VirusTotal, if you don't know, is a great service where it analyzes a file against different AV engines. So, for example, if you're running Sophos or McAfee on your endpoint rather than our solution, and we say something's malicious, you can check VirusTotal to see if that vendor has coverage for that same attack or not. But what we're interested in seeing is actually around 45% of all samples we send to VirusTotal, 45% no one has any other coverage for. So this you could regard as true zero-day attacks. And we're seeing the bulk of them now arrive over email, whereas historically it was delivered by drive-by downloading or compromising a web server of some description. It is now all done through email, whether that be the built-in mail applications that exist in things like LinkedIn, or more so actually the traditional kind of SMTP, IMAP, POP3 based email. And what I want to do is actually kind of show you in real terms how this works. So, an attacker is using email to send malware. Now, once it hits that Proofpoint inspection engine, two things are going to happen. Proofpoint is going to inspect it with their technology, and once you put your API key in, a copy will be sent to Wildfire. And both those analysis engines are going to come back with a verdict. This is clean, this is malicious, this is phishing, or whatever. And depending on how you set up that service, you can then decide whether or not you want to drop this email or quarantine it or allow it to pass, etc. But what's also subtly happening in the background is that your on-premise firewall or the firewalls in the cloud are picking up on the fact that a new file has been inspected and that signature has been pushed down to the firewall. This is quite key because actually periodically we may change our minds on a signature given new information, something that only can happen at runtime or outside of a dedicated analysis environment. And having that knowledge ahead of time that this exists means we can very quickly flip that verdict. But in this scenario, the user downloads the file, the user opens email, the malware is perhaps a dropper, so it's going to try download a secondary payload, and that is denied by the firewall. Where this also comes pretty key is in the next stage, where I might have an interior firewall, a firewall separating my users from my data center or from their branches, etc. And we suddenly decide that that file is now malicious. Well, that user is trying to move that file across the environment, or perhaps they're uploading it to a OneDrive or something along those lines. We can now see that and now shut that down and take that infection vector away. What we also tend to find is users who might be on the road or working from home, who are not sat behind a firewall. They will download something, or they'll bring something into the environment. Typically they might use from personal email accounts or whatever. And once that file hits the endpoint, they try to execute it. Traps, our endpoint solution, sees that and says, hey, this is bad. Okay, so it stops the execution of that file and it updates Wildfire, saying, hey, Wildfire, this file, I stopped it because it did a bad thing. You should have it to do proper analysis and then build a signature or build the IOCs and push them out across all the other products. That's what it does. The benefit you get to this is if that user tries to email that file outbound, again, you have the Proofpoint gateway sat in line, so it's going to be able to look at that file and go, hang on a minute, Wildfire said this was bad. So I'm not going to allow that attachment to perhaps leave the organization, or perhaps email around internally that attachment. We're not going to permit that behavior. So we kind of close it from both angles, whether or not it's a user coming into the environment or if it's someone sending something into the environment who's an external third party. And again, containing that threat to the endpoint or getting it as close to the source as humanly possible, so that cleanup operation is so much easier to do, or you could fully automate it. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to drop out of this and I'm going to show you something a bit more interesting. So this is Autofocus. So this is, for all intents and purposes, the looking glass into the Wildfire database on the back end. And what we've done is we've built a search query that says, show me all of the malicious samples or grayware or phishing samples where the application that carried these malicious samples is SMTP, IMAP, or POP3. And I'm just looking back over the last 6 months just to kind of get some interesting data. Now, as these graphs start to build out, you will start being able to identify certain trends. And the peaks are typically Monday mornings, and the troughs on the download session graph is typically the weekends. And you think about this from a business perspective, right? Most organizations work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And when you start to flick through, you can see, this is Saturday, this is Sunday, and then the following day is a Monday. And everyone comes back, they've got emails over the weekend, download, where we go. And one of the very common things we see is when we start analyzing those Mondays, we actually see that most of the detections happen around anywhere from 8 o'clock in the morning to about 9:30. The idea being is that we think people are coming in, fresh off the back of the weekend, perhaps still a bit misty-eyed, sitting down, opening their email, just flicking through, deleting the obvious junk, but then looking at the one email that they think might be malicious, that they need to action, which actually is weaponized. Yeah, and people tend to not be so attentive at perhaps 8:30, 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and as a result, you see these trends. I mean, we can see that SMTP is the bulk carrier. But we also see POP3 is the second largest carrier. They're roughly 50%. And as an organization, you need to ask yourself, what business do I have that requires POP3 to run in the environment? If I'm on a global trend level, seeing POP3 is the second most popular application to transmit malware for, in the email sense, then do I really need that in my environment? Should I block it? Should I not? And then again, SMTP, obviously, it's key to environments. What we can start doing is, picking out some samples. I've picked out some just to have a look at. So this is one particularly nasty sample. It is a Microsoft Office document. We can see on virus total where it is, got all my indications here. But from an observed behavior, what did it do when it ran? Well, first thing it did was it kind of loaded the WMI library, which is strange in itself. Why would a Word document be trying to do that? And then it moves through and it gets to a PowerShell stage, and then it downloads something, enumerates a module for a specific process, and then it basically does stuff to the system. Now, if we start looking at that process activity, what we can do is we can see that Microsoft Word called the PowerShell application and passed through this function to it. And this function basically acts as an encoder decoder. So at very first glance, you can't really see what it does unless you executed it for real. And what we can then start doing is look at, well, what HTTP request did it make? Well, it did 2 GET requests to these 2 websites, which perfectly fine. But we've only ever seen them once in the wild, and when we saw them, they were used for malicious intent. So we're pretty confident these are bad. And again, you can start looking at some of the other ones. This one's particularly nasty. If you just does things like disable system restore, copies itself, loads of WMI library, does a lot of nasty things. But this is all great information, but how can I utilize it? This is where MindMeld comes in, and it is a free and open source application. It's all on GitHub. You can go and build it yourself. What it does is it acts as a threat intelligence aggregator. So I've got my miners or my input nodes, my processing nodes basically sort the data out, and then my outputs present that data. So if I was to go and search for, let's say, Office 365, just to give you an idea of how it works. This is ingesting Office 365 data, sorting it out into URLs, IP addresses, and then just outputting that information. Okay. What we could do is you could do this for malware feeds. So you could take this threat intelligence feed and feed it back into the Proofpoint platform, or you could feed this into something internally running in your organization. If we know that from the malware analysis that we suddenly decide that this domain is bad, well, I could create a MindMeld kind of setup where all these domains are going to get collected and then basically blacklisted in a Proofpoint offering, or however you want to do it. Because if we know that the domain's bad, why would I ever want to accept emails from them? It's a definite food for thought type of question. But that's kind of it from me on how the high level works behind the integration story. The only thing I will show you is if you already have both technologies, all you have to do is go to the Wildfire portal, go to your account, and then there will be an API key that you simply copy paste into the Proofpoint platform, and that is all you need to do. And it will immediately start working and sending files back and forth between each other. So that is it from me. I hope that made a lot of sense, gave you some things you'd like to think about, and hopefully made it definitely a compelling option going down the Proofpoint or the Palo Alto Networks, really, enhancing both capabilities. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you, Richard, as well. And just like to invite anyone to ask any questions on anything that either Richard or Matt has presented, anything that occurs to them from their own environments, or anything that they're interested in finding more about. Please do take the opportunity to put that into the chat or the questions box, and I will pose those to the presenters over the next couple of minutes. While you hopefully have a few questions for us, I'd just like to thank everyone for their time in attending this morning. We do appreciate it's not easy to take time away from your busy day jobs in order to look at new solutions and take the time to actually review some of these and attend webinars. So thank you very much for that. Also just want to thank both Matt and Richard for their comprehensive presentations this morning. Remind everyone that we do have the recording available, so we'll make sure that after the webinar. And if there's anything specific that you don't want to ask, over the line to the wider audience, please do feel free to send me a note, and I'll make sure that any of your more technical or indeed commercial questions can be answered by the Bytes account management team here. So at the moment, I don't have any questions at the moment that have come through. So I'm just going to wrap up and thank everyone for their time. We're actually on time, which is pretty good. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to attend. Thanks very much to our presenters, and I look forward to sharing the recording with you over the next few hours. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for your time to all the attendees. Have a good day.
Yes, thank you. Good.